If everybody seems to be pretty happy with the process and so forth, I would like to hear a little bit about that. The other thing I'd like to say is my wife is on that committee, and she has just spoken extremely highly of the two of you that she thinks you've done a great job. So.
Check we give them. That really well.
We have a few slides that we prepared, and maybe we could go through that and
fine, by all means.
Addresses some of the things that you are asking about. So again, my name is Chad Marley, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer for the college, and I was part of both the Budget Process Advisory Committee and the Budget Resource Allocation Committee. I'm going to discuss the BPAC, which is the Budget Process Advisory Committee, and then Cindy will follow me with discussions on the BRAC, the Budget Resource Allocation Committee. So up here you can see the list of the members on this committee. It was a great broad representation of campus, faculty, staff, administration that made up the committee. And our charge that was given to us was to create a process map and develop an inclusive, objective, and transparent business budget process tied to efforts for continuous improvement. Around the AQUIP process was to really document what we have done over the past several years and try to improve that. And part of what we wanted to do was make sure that it was inclusive of all the groups on campus, that we were objective in trying to meet the goals of the college, the missions and the goals, and then be transparent in how the decisions were made on what we were doing. So to start out, we identified what we felt as a committee were four main areas of concern. And the first one was communication. And the rationale denials of the approvals had not been provided previously. And so we wanted to make sure that we addressed that. Decisions made in one area that it directly impacted another area. So there may have been a budget request that was approved, say for a classroom, but then IT was not necessarily notified that that was approved and something we need to plan for. So that was part of our efforts in making sure that we had enough communication. The second part was consistency and creating the same criteria across campus, and then operating expenses, positions, and one-time monies were scrutinized differently was the perception around campus, and we wanted to try to eliminate that and make sure that everything was looked through the same lens, so to speak. The third thing that we identified was transparency. In the decision-making process, it wasn't always clear on how the decision was arrived at, or why a decision was denied, or why another one was accepted or altered. And so that was part of what we wanted to make sure happened, was that communication got back to the groups so that there was less confusion about what was occurring. And then the last thing was timing. We felt like there was a request or perception that we needed to start the process much earlier in the year as opposed to waiting until February. And you'll see as we go through the process a little bit, that's pretty hard to do, because a lot of our assumptions are based off of revenue projections or legislative actions that we don't really understand until much later, until March, into March or April even. After we identified these four key areas, we took it back to the different constituents on campus to make sure that they felt like these were the things that we should be addressing through the business or budget process committee. And we did receive confirmation that these were the right things. So we felt good about that, and that's what we focused on. So as a starting point, the BPAC used the current LCCC budget process manual that was currently in place. And then going forward, we worked to identify all the groups and individuals that were involved in the budget process. So the Board of Trustees establishing the goals at the beginning of the process in July, all the way through President's Cabinet and identifying one-time funds and the the budget office and cost center managers and individuals that needed to participate in the process. So then we created a working document that ended up being our LCCC process map for the budget process. So the process map was tied to the budget timeline, which is in essence a continual 12-month process. And we'll see that here in a few minutes. And it's based off, the starting point is really the Board of Trustee directives, goals that are established in late July. And then that really kicks off the budget process for the next year. Feedback built into the system throughout the process. Decision-making rubric was developed. And you can't see it there, but a bin list was created and addressed. And we'll have an example of those as well. So this is hard to see, but I think it's in your April budget book, towards the end, the back page. The next 3 slides, I believe, kind of show at a high level all the different areas that are involved in the budget process on campus. The vertical columns are basically representing the task or the communication or the decision making criteria. The rectangle boxes are something that needs to be done. The circles are communication that needs to happen. And then the diamond is a decision process or decision that needs to occur. So on this page, there's 5 different groups here, and then goes on through to the vice presidents. The BPAC has things that need to occur, the budget office, and cost center managers. Okay, this is our really busy map. It was actually a really complicated process to try to identify all the tasks that needed to occur that do occur. And it became quite confusing, which is why we developed a color coding system, so we could try to keep it, at least try to be readable. And the important part to remember is that this was the initial first pass at creating this process. And so as we're going through the budget process and learning, we will revise and make continuous improvement on the process and hopefully the presentation of it, because it is really confusing and it's really long. And I won't read all the steps, but the starting point is by the end of July, the Board of Trustees established strategic plan and board goals, and that's really what kicks off the budget process. And then it continues on throughout the year. There's different, as I said, there's different groups, constituents that are involved that have different tasks throughout the year to get done. I think one of the things that was important for the group, you see lots of circles here, and this was our attempt to make sure that we're getting communication back out to campus or back to the group that needs to move on with the next step in the process. And so we really focused on trying to make sure that we identified key areas where the process or the information was communicated back out, and we wanted to identify where those were because it's really important to, as you saw, the number one thing was the communication piece of it. So. Okay, so out of our group we developed, well, we kind of took a couple of things and combined them and created a rubric that we suggested was to be used on looking at the budget, especially for the BRAC committee. The first one was alignment with the board established priorities and goals. And then the next 8 items, is this in their book too? Yes, it is. The next 8 items were things that had been used previously by the President's Cabinet when they were looking at the budget before. And so we combined those 2 activities, and this is what we suggested for the BRAC committee to use for the rubric on making the decisions. We wanted to develop the tool. We didn't want to tell them how to do it. So Cindy will talk about that a little bit, about how it was used, how the tool was used. And then this is a sample of some of the bin list questions that were happening. So what we did was, as the committee was working through this process, we would come up with questions or things that we felt like needed to be addressed. And we wouldn't always be able to answer those questions at the meeting itself, and we'd have to go back, and Jane would have to do research, or Carol would have to do some research to help us answer those questions and determine how we wanted to do it. So we kept a working list of all these questions that we came up with. I think we ended up with 25 or 27. Some of them were multiple questions in one thing, but it was really important for the group that as we identified these, because they were coming from our constituents into this group, that we were able to address them and identify a solution, or at least a response to all of them. So, okay, I'm going to turn it over.
So the next step in the process was, after the budget process committee met, then the college established the Budget Resource Allocation Committee, I'm going to refer to as BRAC from here on out. And basically we had two charges. The first charge was for us to prioritize and make recommendations for one-time fund requests. And then our second charge was to make recommendations for balancing the 2013-2014 budget. And very much like the BPAC, the BRAC was comprised of people from across campus. Some members of the BPAC were also on BRAC, and then there were other individuals from across campus, which for the committee was invaluable because it gave us a wide view of all the different areas that our campus covers and serves. And we did have a student on it. Unfortunately, a couple things happened. One, he's a student, and two, he got sick. So he made a couple of our first meetings, but he wasn't able to make the rest of them. And we did ask if there was another student senator that was interested, and I don't know if it was scheduling or whatever, because when we started having our meetings, we met a lot. We spent a lot of quality time together. So, and so the very first thing we did before we ever looked at any of the budget numbers, any one-time requests, is we wanted to establish what our process was going to be, or processes were going to be. And so before we ever met, we decided on the following things: that we would individually, as 10 separate people instead of one committee, we would go and rank all the one-time requests that were sent in. And then once those individual scores were compiled, we actually sent them in to another, Dennis McAllister, who's on our committee. He actually compiled them into a nice, wonderful little Excel spreadsheet and ranked them based on the 10 scores that he received. We also really wanted to make sure that people that had put in requests, et cetera, that they had the opportunity, and if you want to use the word power, to be held accountable for explaining if the committee had questions. And so we decided that any follow-up questions that we had would be directed directly to the cost center managers, that we would CC the appropriate dean and or vice president as was needed for that specific area. And initially, we weren't really sure about doing email. We really definitely felt that there was a time crunch, and so we thought that email was the most efficient way to use everybody's time. And it actually ended up that the committee really liked the email, because we all received the exact same information, as opposed to, say for example, Chad going and talking to somebody in his area, and then him coming back to the committee and saying, well, I talked to so-and-so, and this is what he or she said. The emails allowed everybody on the committee to receive the exact same information. So it ended up being a good thing. And then we also decided that we definitely need to give justifications for our recommended denials, and that had to be provided to the college community through Eagle's Eye or the website, our college website. We also, as a part of the process, as we discussed, on the ranking criteria that Chad had shown you, student needs definitely rose to the top, but we also felt it was very important that the infrastructure of the college needed to be addressed. And so we thought that 25% of the one-time funds should be directed to the infrastructure of the college. And then we also set high and low limits that the committee would or would not look at, and we determined anything above $50,000 we would not address because we simply didn't have a big pool of money. We had $300,000, and anything below $2,000 we thought it was most appropriate to come out of individual budgets, department or division budgets. So that's how we handled the one-time fund requests. And then for the budget, the committee decided that we would use the 3 areas that were asked of departments and deans and vice presidents to make cuts at. We really did not want to get into looking at line-by-line items of the budget. So, and we followed a lot of the same processes that if there's something that didn't make sense to us, we were going to go back to the cost center managers and ask those questions because we weren't the experts in those respective areas. And then again, the appropriate dean and or vice president were included on those emails, trying to keep everybody in the loop, so to speak. And then once those questions were answered, then if there were discussions or those types of things, then that's how the committee based it off of the information that we got. And the questions that we did have, once people explained the parts that we were unsure of, it made sense, and so there really wasn't that much else from that standpoint. And so then our one-time request recommendations have been presented to both President's Cabinet and to College Council. They were presented to President's Cabinet 2 weeks ago, and they were presented to College Council last Friday. And then there's only one item that was above $30,000 that was approved by BRAC, and that shows up on page 15 of your guys' book. It's in the board's book. And then in terms of our observations and recommendations, the BRAC is actually, we're going to try to meet hopefully sometime here, not hopefully, sometime in the next 2 weeks to really kind of talk about the process and what we think went well. And we already have come up with some things. First off, we thought that the committee was very good at representing our entire campus. There were numerous times in our discussions that we had that one individual, because of the area that they were familiar with in our campus, could answer questions or explain things to the other committee members, and so we thought that worked really, really well. We did believe that our emails that we sent at times, well, they caught everybody by surprise. So we really believed as a committee that one of the best things for the future would be to send basically an email out to the college community that says, just wanted to let you know that the BRAC is going to be meeting. You may be receiving an email from us requesting additional information, just to kind of give people a heads up instead of it surprising people. So, and then we also as a committee thought that it was very important to have either 2 student representatives because of scheduling and those types of things, or have 1 student and 1 alternate. Because our meetings, when we started meeting, we met every day for approximately a week and a half, and our schedules were pretty tough to get in there, so much less a student schedule with homework and preparing for tests and those kinds of things. And then the other thing was that we really thought it would be good for the cost center managers to provide more information that specifically addressed the board's goals and or the college priorities and their information that they presented. So what questions do you have for Chad?
Let me open it up then to the board first. Any board members with questions? None. I think you made a good presentation. What about staff and faculty? Any questions? Questions from the general public? I guess at this point, I'll just open up and ask a couple questions. After all, you came here tonight.
Absolutely,
You
go
should
right
have to
ahead.
ask, you should have to answer a couple questions. You know, if I had barometers of the budget process, they'd be Jay O'Brien and Dana McCammon. And so, did they seem to be fairly pleased with this process, or at least feel like it was an improvement over prior years? Or, you know, I hate to put you on the spot to speak for others, but those two are people who would be critical and noisy if they felt things weren't going well.
Let Chad answers. The only question that I've had really asked thus far is how information was getting back, and that was actually asked at College Council. And with the process being new, the information's out there. Part of College Council's role is to give that information back to their constituents. And so I'm not sure if it's just that College Council met on Friday. Some people know about like our recommendations for one-time fund requests. And the conversations that we've had have actually been, because it's a really good question. I know for me, I actually went back and said, okay, how is all this supposed to fit together with it being our first time? And that feedback, one of the biggest places is once it's presented, it comes from President's Cabinet, College Council, and then after this meeting, that information gets relayed back out again. So within about 2 weeks' time, there's 3 different times that people are told, hey, just so you're aware, this has been recommendations. But overall, I haven't had anybody want to beat me up, though I have given up trying to become prom queen. But other than that, I don't know if Chad's had feedback.
Well, both those individuals participated on the BPAC.
Feedback.
And so that was good, and I think, you know, one of the things about creating these committees across campus is getting the involvement of everybody, or giving the opportunity at least for people to step up and say that they want to participate. And so I know Dana and Jay both participated on the BPAC, and I think, I haven't talked to Dana, but in talking to Jay, I know that, you know, he liked that he was able to bring up his concerns and express his concerns. And then, you know, as part of our responsibilities on College Council is to disseminate that information. And you can't make them read it or look at it, but at least we're providing it to them and providing them the opportunity to review it and then ask questions of us as College Council members.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a nice presentation.
Thank you.
The next item on our agenda will be the fiscal year 2014 budget first reading, and I'll just turn that over to Joe.
I hope that doesn't take off on me. I think Cindy and Chad broke it on purpose. No, I think it's just overheated. And,
I guess he's going to have to.
that was most likely without a room full of bodies raising the temperature. There, it's coming on. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, while the bulb is warming back up or cooling down to warm back up, we have a presentation. Carol and I will go through and tag team this presentation. I will admit that, that there's some detailed information in here. I'm actually going to try to keep it as high level as possible. As we did last year, we'll reference slides to pages within your budget book. I would encourage you to follow along. Mr. Chairman, I will leave it to you. If as we go through it, you feel that the trustees want to ask questions at that point in time, certainly happy to stop, or if we want us just to go through the presentation and then open up for dialogue after that, we're happy to do it as well. But for the new trustees specifically, there may be terminology and things I'll reference in here. I will do my best to stop and just remind folks and sort of point out what those are. But it is a complex subject that we'll try to move through in a timely fashion. So please, write down your questions or stop me as you go through. One of the things that helps me sort of contextualize the budget as we put it together, and I think is useful, is looking at those things externally and internally that are influencing the college, specifically the college's finances. I've outlined these in my memorandum to you with this budget, but I want to walk through just a few of them. The first one shouldn't be any surprise. As we all know, the governor recommended and the legislature confirmed a 6% reduction in aid to the community colleges as part of the supplemental budget through this past legislative session. From the community college perspective, that equated to about a $5.6 million reduction in state aid to the community colleges. The legislature also provided one-time funds, and I'll just hit on them here briefly, but then talk about them in a few minutes. The first is they allocated funds for what they're calling an employee retention bonus. These funds go to the community colleges, the university, as well as most of the state agencies. It started as a request from the governor for a base building pay raise. It ended up in being a one-time retention incentive that the legislature had included within the budget. I'll talk a little bit more about that as well in a second. As many of you have probably also heard, there was a legislation to increase the contributions to the employee retirement system by 1% over the next few years. There was considerable conversation right up until the end of the legislature whether we were going to include it, what structure, how did it work. Probably the simplest way to explain it is that it will be a phased-in portion of it. 0.5% will be required going into 2014. Of that, the state funded a portion of it. The college will have to fund a portion of it, and the employee will have to fund a portion of it, and it will be ramped up until we hit the 1% contribution. And then the last one, we did make a request to the governor for enrollment growth funds. Enrollment growth is one of the mechanisms that's in statute for community colleges to request additional funding to the legislature on an annual and biennial basis for enrollment growth since 2004. 2004 is the magic year because that was the base year where we essentially created this new funding model, and that's when we took the initial census of what enrollment was, and so everything is growth since 2004. We make a request as part of the biennial process, but then we also are allowed to bring requests as part of the supplemental budget process as well. It's a confusing system, and I think with the turnover in the legislature, many folks have forgotten what the mechanism of this is and what it's for, and as a result of that, the governor did deny our request for enrollment growth funds, and the legislature continued that. At the Wyoming Community College Commission level, there was also some things that will be influencing the budget. One of those, as you all know, they voted in December to raise tuition 5% starting this fall. The other piece, though, is at the beginning of this biennium and starting in FY13, they carved out 10% of the variable funding to community colleges to be funded based on completion or performance. And the way they define that is successful course completion. So about $8 million was carved out and is funded to the campuses based on the percent of their total credits that derive from a successful completion in a course. So a C, B, A, and passing grades and those things. I mentioned to the board last year, LCCC did not fare well in this analysis. And in fact, I believe we had the lowest course completion rate of the 7 community colleges. I don't know where the other colleges are, but I actually think our completion rate decreased slightly going into this year. So we'll likely see an impact as a result of the course completion component. The other thing that I wanted to just point out with that is that the commission at their April 19th meeting coming up will be discussing whether or not to continue doing that approach to performance funding or completion funding, if you will. There's been conversation about shifting that $8 million to a collaborative grant program that would encourage the colleges to work together on some major issues such as developmental education. At this point, my recommendation to you, and I believe the trustees' recommendations to the commission, are that we leave it as is. The course completion component is about as good as we feel prepared to implement, and anything else would be a hasty retreat from something that we just started trying. But know that in the future, that $8 million may be in play for a different mechanism. A few other things. We estimate local valuation to be up. You will see this in a few minutes in your in our anticipated revenue for 1 mill funding, as well as the local funding that's associated with our 4 mills. And then looking to the future and how we'll accommodate some of the could-be's in this budget. Many of you have probably read that the legislature, through their supplemental budget, had asked the governor to basically ask the state agencies to, again, come with 4%, 6%, and 8% reduction plans as we go into the next biennium. The governor at the time had said, let's wait and see what happens with the revenue projections before we decide what to do. However, the legislature's leadership council again passed a resolution and said they will be working with the agencies and asking us to bring reduction plans again for the next biennium, irregardless of where the revenue projections are. So we are looking at and anticipating some work associated with, again, bringing plans for how we would accommodate 4%, 6%, or 8% cuts to the overall budget. And then the last one, and I don't have the answers for this, is, we're looking at and considering what the impacts of sequestration may be directly on the college. You probably have read and have heard about $50 million of mineral royalties that the federal government has agreed to hold back from the states. We've heard about the freezing or the elimination of tuition assistance programs within some of our military branches. We know that some of our specific grant programs here, such as Sage Trio, may receive a reduction. The one thing we don't know is we don't exactly know how all that will play out and how that will impact our budget, and whether or not it will be in FY13, or FY14, FY15, or never, to be quite honest with you. But it is one of those uncertainties. My best guess is that what we will see and feel will be indirect impacts of that. For example, we believe, as you all know, we have a 2009 bondish series that has been issued, and they were part of the Build America bond programs. Those bonds were subsidized in portion by the government. As part of sequestration, we've been told that they will most likely remove that subsidy, which could mean that we'll be paying $30,000 more per year to service the debt on those bonds, predominantly through the lease that we have with the building authority. Those are the types of things that I think are going to sneak out as a result of sequestration, and they're incredibly difficult to plan for. So now I want to talk about some internal influences as we looked at building this budget. Probably the one that has me sort of the most concerned, and perhaps I shouldn't be, but I am, is the continual downward trend of our enrollment. We're looking at the fourth semester where we've seen a decrease in overall enrollment, predominantly on our FTE, our full-time equivalents, but we're starting to see that trend in headcount as well. With that downward trend, not only do we struggle with the desire to enroll more students and engage more students in higher education, but with that comes some complicating factors: decreased tuition revenue, fee revenues, and those types of things. And so we're watching that trend, and it does have an impact on our budget. And then probably one of the most influential, as you heard from the Chad and Cindy, was the board's priorities. As we went into this year, you set these priorities: invest in instruction, keep progressing on the facilities plan, invest in student services, continue to find opportunities for organizational stability and strategic planning. We've taken those to heart, and your first three, you have the most connection or influence on this budget, but you see smatterings of the other two within the budget as well. And then the last two, which really didn't fall in any neat category, so I call those other institutional needs. Last year, you made it clear as a board that you wanted us to move base expenditures off of the 1 mill fund and keep the funds associated with the 1 mill more liquid. and to have them available for just-in-time needs associated with facility planning or facilities projects or other things. And we've taken that to heart. And then the other one, after a few years of pay freezes, was the certainty and the push, especially after the work that the campus has done to balance this budget, that we need to reward our employees with at least a cost of living adjustment. So built into this is a consideration of what a cost of living adjustment or a pay plan would mean to this budget.
Mr. President, but before we leave that slide, could I just ask one question? The downward enrollment trends, is this purely demographic, or are there other influences, or do you know at this point?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, good question. I don't know specifically. I believe it could be a function of two environmental things. One is we are seeing and will see for the next few years a decrease in the total number of high school graduates in Wyoming. It could just very well be, since we tailor to such a traditional high school graduate market, that downward trend is part of it. We are seeing decreases, though, in our young adult population as well, and especially in our, as I mentioned, in our full-time equivalency versus head counts. It could be a function of the economy. People sought higher education as we went into the recession, even though Wyoming weathered that better than other states. As we climb out, or as perhaps they get, frustrated with trying to use higher education as a harbor from economic issues, they're starting to climb back out. Those are the two external environmental things that I believe are impacting this, just looking at where the decreases are happening. What we don't know is what we're doing to discourage enrollment.
May I follow up on that?
Sure.
You refer to this trend relative to the enrollment as a downward trend. I don't know. I don't see it as a downward trend, the way I look at this. It appears to me like it's leveled off a bit, and that we had a spike in the 2010, 2011, and if you look at 2011, 2012, it's a little bit lower than 2011, but it's higher than 2010. So that's kind of a spike, and maybe I'm dealing in semantics, but it looks like it's more of a leveling of the full-time equivalents. Now, it's a continuing growth with the head count, and well over 6,000 in the head count. So I think it might be misleading to say that we have a downward enrollment trend.
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Erickson, it's a fair point, and two things I'll say to that. One, just for your reference, the graph that you're looking at in your manuals concludes as of fiscal year 12. We are now just wrapping up fiscal year 13. The downward trend of FTE, when we present final numbers to you in terms of FY13, when we wrap it up, you will see that FTE number drop again. When we actually map the 2012-13 data on there, and headcount will drop as well in there. And so, but the other point, and what people have suggested to me, we're okay with this. We went through a decade of astronomical growth. Getting a little breather while we regroup and restabilize may be an okay thing. So from an institutional perspective, there are folks and there are legitimate arguments that suggest leveling off or a slight downward trend may be okay. My point here is that it has an impact on our fiscal budget, and that's really the thing. And as we look at future data points and look at a semester data point on there, you will see that at least for 4 semesters, that downward trend has continued, even though it doesn't quite show in the head count on the with the FY12 numbers. And I could have pulled up that slide to show, I know you're looking at it. You could see as the head count here has continued to grow. The other thing, when we look at disaggregating some of the populations, we have continued to have growth in concurrent enrollment. So the high school students who are in high school, and that would account for larger numbers of heads versus full-time equivalents. But the piece that we're looking at is actually a decrease in our traditional age college students that tend to go more than full-time, and that's why we're having that impact on the FTE. A few other
Ed.
Before you go on, and maybe we'll get this down the road, but do you have any data indicating that we are seeing some of those Hathaway scholarship students shifting to UW because, again, they can afford that with that scholarship? Do we know any of the impact that's having either on our institution alone or system-wide?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Mosher, I don't have those data. It's certainly something we can look at. We've been having considerable conversations around the system at the vice president level, at the presidential level, the commission level, about what the impacts are and what's happening with Hathaway. As you know, the legislature and some of the state agencies have been trying to get a handle on studying Hathaway to see what's actually happening. We had some changes to Hathaway legislation this year that changed some of the curriculum requirements that could again skew the baseline of looking at that. There are some studies that are underway, and folks are talking about it. I don't have good data now. As soon as I do, be happy to present that to the board. So let me run through a few other contextual slides. And again, these are comparative slides that show different things up to FY12. Because we have not completed FY13, the fiscal year we're in right now, those data aren't on here. So consider them contextual. Last year I showed you up to FY11. And I will continue to do this just to try to give LCCC's operating a budget, give it a perspective with the other Wyoming community colleges. This first one is just comparative revenue per FTE. And you can see we've had this continual trend to be below the average in terms of revenue per FTE with a slight uptick here in 2012. And I'll talk about why we think that is why the revenue got closer to that Wyoming average per student FTE. So these are all equalized. I know Eastern Wyoming Community College is smaller than LCCC, but we equalize it by using the divisor of FTE, so it's more comparative based on our enrollment size. When we look at sources of revenues, here's a shift from last year. Not surprisingly, because we are the largest community college, we generate higher revenue from our tuition and fees, both because of the fee levels as well as just the sheer number of students that we have. But last year, we actually received a lesser state appropriation, FY11, sorry, state appropriation per FTE. And as you can see in FY12, where we concluded we actually had above average state appropriation. Part of that is because some of the shifts in our enrollment. Part of that is because of the previous year's enrollment growth and the way it adjusted the model and the way they look at expenditures and variable expenses. So we saw a slight increase. I don't know that it's statistically significant, but it did bump us up, whereas we were below. Not surprisingly, local appropriations were below the average. We have some campuses that have high valuation and they receive greater revenues from their local appropriations, and other sources essentially equal. Now, when we look at expenditures, again, you would assume a very similar trend to revenue per student FTE. If we're balancing our budget, we should be expending those revenues, and so we would anticipate that. Again, we have spent less per student up until FY12, and then notice how we climbed up. There's two things I think that are going on there. The first one, as I mentioned, is as enrollment dropped, but our funding, because of the lag of the model changes, went up, we actually had more funding that was applied across fewer students. But the big piece here, if you remember, we had to spend down a significant amount of our fund balance in FY12. It was about $2 million. So we had to bring in $2 million to spend down that fund balance, and that artificially inflated the amount of money we spent per students.
Mr. President, does the mix of level 1, 2, and 3 classes and the amount of money we get back from the state, does that impact this, or is that pretty much consistent from year to year?
I don't know specifically campus to campus, but in general, in looking at the assessment, the percentage of the variation amongst the 7 community colleges really isn't all that different. We do not have campuses that are so heavily in the applied or level 3 or heavy lab type courses that really distinguishes any one from any other. So I don't think that there is much impact on that calculation based on campus redistribution. And then the last one I want to show out, or I want to illustrate and have you actually look at, because I'll refer to this here, is our comparative FY12 expenditures per FTE by program. And so for the new trustees specifically, a lot of times we think program, we think, oh, nursing or English. No, these are actual descriptors of budget type programs. I believe they originated from the National Association of College and University Business Officers, or NACUBO, and they're pretty ubiquitous across higher education financing. And it's a way to distinguish or disaggregate how revenues are spent to the various functions of the campus. And again, these were from FY12, so concluding last year. And what you see is we spent slightly below the Wyoming average in instruction, so direct instruction, slightly above in public service, but again, a very nominal amount of money comparatively, slightly above in academic support, below in student services, below in instructional support, above in plant operations, and then above in scholarships as well. This again is a way for us to see how are we distributing our revenues, our funding, our expenditures comparative to the other community colleges in Wyoming. And it's an important context. And so again, you know, look, below in instruction, public service, a little bit higher in academic support, below in student services, below in institutional support, above in plant, and then above in scholarships. And that's important as we look at the changes as we go into FY14. So I'm going to talk about the operating budget, and then I'm going to have Carol walk through the other funds. For the purpose of this conversation, I'm really referring to two funds. One is the unrestricted fund, and that starts on page 16 in your budget book. This is the largest fund that we have. It's unrestricted. It's predominantly funded by revenue from state appropriation and tuition and fees. So we call it unrestricted because this is the bulk of the money we can do what we please with, essentially. The other part of this is 1 mil, and it is a separate fund. We account for it separately, but the 1 mil, which you approve on a biennial basis, it's a permissive levy that you approve on a biennial basis, really gives us revenue to do other things, and it is essentially unrestricted. So when we look at both of those funds, that essentially makes up what I consider our operating budget. The other funds that Carol will talk about are more designated or restricted for very specific purposes. So the information I'm going to chat with you about, it really focuses on those two, unrestricted funds and the 1 mil.
Mr. President, Trustee Erickson would like to ask a question.
You separate the 1 mil from the unrestricted funds. Is there a statutory reason for that, or is that just to be able to demonstrate where that 1 mil money is going?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Erickson, I will take an attempt, and Carol, not if I get this wrong. I don't believe there's a statutory requirement to account for those separately. There are Wyoming Community College Commission guidelines that ask for our budgeting information and report as it rolls up. This whole book is essentially formatted in some point, or the final budget you'll approve, based on guidelines that the commission gives us, and so it goes up, and they, I believe, ask us to actually disaggregate all funds as we advance those things up. It also serves as a good mechanism to assess what's happening within that specific funding stream, so there's value in doing that. But from an operational standpoint, it does represent, you know, in some years, like this year, $1.9 million of money that we can use to operate on.
And the 1 mil fund is an unrestricted fund. It's not restricted.
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Erickson, that's correct.
Mr. President, maybe if I could clarify, and I might have this wrong myself, but that 1 mil fund, we vote to reauthorize on a schedule. And that's one of the reasons that we wanted it pried loose from underlying campus ongoing operations, is that there may be a board in the future who decides not to renew that. And so that's also a good reason for keeping it very separate.
Yeah, correct, Dr. Kilty. That is exactly right. Every 2 years, so next July, you will be able to consider and act upon whether or not you want to exercise your authority to levy that additional 1 mil for another 2 years. And that's something that we do every 2 years.
The next time is this coming July or the following?
July of 2014. So this slide on page 12 illustrates a linear change in basically expenditures or investment by program. And there's a few things that I want to point out with this one because it shows some trends. You know, one of the things that I want to point out right away is that percent change in large budget numbers can be misleading. Because when you look at large budget numbers with a small percent change, the actual total dollar change that happens there could be very significant. So, you know that percent change based on the budget size can make a difference, and I'll point out one in public service here in a second. The other piece with this is we're really in a year with little or no new funds. In fact, overall, if you look at the reductions we'll be taking, it actually is a significant reduction to the revenues that we have available to use. And so I might encourage you, instead of looking at positive percent change, look at the variation between the negative percent change on some of these line items. So let me walk through them quickly. Again, we are trying to hold true and continue to move more resources to instruction. And again, here's an example where our fan will blow up, but you have it on, and we'll let that cool down for a second, Vicki, while they look at it in their books. But we've tried to make a purposeful investment in instruction again this year, and actually have seen a positive change for the 4th year in the investment in instruction. It equates to less than 1%, 0.85%, but really comes out to about $160,000 of new money moved into instruction for this year. Public service, you see that 5% change. This is where things can get a little bit misleading. That actually represents a $12,000 increase in public service, and that $12,000 is essentially to work on the sound system in CCI. Try to get it. It's a one-time only expenditure that we put in there so we could start rectifying the sound and some of the issues in the large Centennial room over there. But $12,000 makes a pretty big percent change in public service. Academic support, we saw a decrease, and again, this is trying to rebalance and reallocate some of the funds associated with administrative support or academic support and try to redirect that into some of your priority areas like instruction and student services. So you'll see a decrease there. Student services, about a 0.7% increase. That reflects essentially the money we set aside to invest in student services, predominantly the new advising model. Again, it's less than 1%, but it's a significant increase for student services. Institutional support, we really cut back and took a look at overhead expenditures this year and said, how can we start to cut back and really look at areas where we can cut to absorb these without impacting those core areas of the institution, the things that touch the students most directly. And we really dug in there. If you look at that, that's a negative 7% change decrease. Plant and operations went up by 10%. And this is the point where I want to show you that we are doing some things, I'll point out, in the one mill, actually pulling fund balance to do some projects. One of them specifically is the expansion of the CTE building. Pulling out money, so since we're going to spend some of the fund balance in one mill, we pull that into the budget. That is going to elevate that increase there in plant funds. It also includes funds that we've set aside for planning within the one mill so we can continue the facilities planning. It's about $250,000 just to keep working on the planning aspects, residence hall and some of those other things. That's that increase. And then scholarships, which jumps out as a 19% increase. And I know students and people have always said, wait a minute, you're really going to take scholarships to that amount off the table. There's two things happening here. One, we've carried the employee benefit, the tuition waiver benefit, in the scholarship line item. And that may be technically appropriate because it is a scholarship. We're waiving tuition for employees and their family members to do that. But it's really a human resource benefit. So part of this reduction is shifting those expenditures into institutional support, into HR. The other two areas that are impacted predominantly, one is we sunsetted the Golden Eagle Scholarship. And for those of you that know the Golden Eagle Scholarship, it was last year I think about $387,000. That essentially went to students with a certain GPA, but then who participated in different groups like SGA, and the more groups you participated in, the more scholarship you got, and then they had to take the freshman seminar. There were a few things. It was a lot of money that was essentially going to students who are already here, already engaged, and probably were already going to succeed. And the value of what we got from an institution and helping grow student success, it really wasn't there. It was sort of this catch-all where we just gave money to students. And what we're doing here is proposing, since we're eliminating that program, $200,000 of it is coming off to help us balance the budget. But that other $187,000 will actually go back into programs that we feel we can leverage more strategically. There are some reductions in here in athletic scholarships, as well as some reductions in what we call the free class waivers. We had sort of a catch-all free class waiver that funded some great things. A GED completer could get a free course if they finished their GED. but it also funded free courses for teachers in the community, for city employees, and we wanted to really take a hard look at the resources that we were putting on the table. So while the 19% seems large, and it did equate to, you know, over $200,000, I think our students will continue to see and probably see a greater level of financial support because of our efforts trying to more strategically align those allocations. So those are the big changes. And I'll stop here for a second to see if there's any questions. This just represents last year's budget to what we're proposing for FY14. And so you can see from a pie perspective some of the shifts that we are trying to make and will continue to make over years. I have a feeling we will make much greater headway in years where we have new monies, but we didn't want to let the reduction stop us from actually making those shifts even in a budget reduction year. No questions, I'll plow on. Okay. Now this is where the details come, and I think where you probably find your most interest. So again, from the operating budget, we've historically looked at two different things as we move into proposing the budget. And mostly, this is the money that's moving. So this is after we've gone through and cost center managers have projected their operating budgets, and the BRAC has gone in and looked at it, Cabinet has gone in and looked at it, College Council has gone in and looked at the line item. This really represents money that's moving. So the first one is new funds as we go through, and I just want to walk through a few quickly. Stop me if there's anything that I haven't covered or you have a question on. 1.16 million is our 6% cut. That's what we know we will be taking. So we'll have to reduce 1.16. The reduction in our course completion is 50,000. The 130,869, that's that employee retention incentive that I mentioned. That's the money that's available as a one-time payment from the legislature. It is intended to go to the employees one time. The legislation is a little confusing. It initially says it should be distributed in October, but then there's accompanying legislation that says community college boards of trustees can decide how to distribute these funds, which leads us to interpret that the prior language refers to state agencies, and then that language gives community college boards the ability to say when they want to distribute it and how all that good stuff happens. The 25,000 represents the state's share of that 0.5% increase in the employee retirement. And then you'll see a series of projected decreases in fee revenue. 75,000 for miscellaneous courses, 120 for our high-tech fee, 30,000 in the athletic fee. Again, those are just a reflection of what we believe enrollment will do in FY14. The 831,000 is the second year of enrollment growth. Now remember I said we asked for more enrollment growth, the supplemental, which was another type of request, but each biennium we can actually make a request. The legislature did fund some enrollment growth in the budget session. It equates to about $830,000 per fiscal year in this biennium. That $800,000 represents the second year of that. One of the things to remember, and you'll see it there though, this is one-time money. We cannot guarantee it's going to be here. So within this budget, we've had to take care to make sure we have $831,000 of one-time money that's sitting there. So if the legislature says no more enrollment growth, we don't have commitments that we have to reduce in the coming year. You'll see then a couple of the valuation, 256,000 is what we estimate our local support valuation increase there. 150,000 is what we anticipate may be additional revenue because of the 5% tuition increase. And then 50,000 for the 1 mil, again, the valuation growth of the 1 mil. So all said and done, when we look at new money, we've got just shy of $4,000 going into this year. And remember, 800 and some thousand of that is, well, really even almost $1 million of it is one time. So we're really talking about significant reduction. So we didn't want to let that keep us from meeting your priorities and really doing some good things for the campus. So we said, okay, if we're going to do new things, we got to reallocate internally. We simply have to reallocate internally. So when we look down here, these are the reallocated internal funds. So if you remember, as we went into FY13, we did two things. We said, look, we know this conversation of budget cuts is coming around the corner. We're not sure what it's going to mean, at what level, so let's be smart. The first thing we did is we set aside over $400,000 in an enrollment reserve. If enrollment goes down or we have to essentially take a cut in FY14, let's just take some of that money off the plate now instead of reallocating it and have it available. Then when we got the actual valuation changes in August, if we remember, we did a budget amendment in August or September. And we said, we think we'll have $500,000 more because of the way valuation has actually come in slightly up. We said, let's not spend it. We're going to stick this in the reserve. As a result, we had almost $1 million of unallocated funds that were in reserve that we had not committed. That essentially wiped out all but about $160,000 of that 6% reduction. It was very conservative budgeting that allowed us to take that hit with feeling very, very little pain. And I think that was a wise move. It still doesn't leave us enough money to do the things we need to do. We still need to make up the 164. So there were other things that we had to take a look at. We left about $460,000 of vacancies or replacement positions unfilled on the market. Part of these were the continued implementation of some of the college brain trusts, reorganization issues. We said, let's pull those out. The scholarship, the $200,000 reduction in scholarship. And then we looked at it, as you recall, managing our part-time employees. We went into this saying, let's not impact our full-time employees. We don't want to do RIFs. We don't want to see reductions. We don't want to impact our full-time employees. So how can we be more efficient and look at our student salaries, our part-time salaries, and our adjunct salaries, and try to reduce that? While these didn't hit the goals we had set for reductions, reducing adjunct expenditures by $280,000, part-time expenditures by $110,000 isn't anything to sneeze at. So I think folks really said, let's take a look at it. Part of the problem is, too, we're anticipating investing in 4 new full-time faculty positions. We don't know yet exactly where those are going to land, so we don't know if there might be greater relief. The other thing we've committed to, though, is actually taking a very strategic approach to our enrollment and managing our enrollment to make sure that we're not running courses undersubscribed unnecessarily, so that we think we can make up some ground there. And then the area where I was really impressed, and in fact, even in the instructional areas, we basically said in many of the instructional areas, work on your adjunct and those part-time salaries, and keep your operating expenditures where they at. We didn't want to take it out of operating, and yet many of the instructional areas actually dug in and said, we can be more lean, we can do this, we want to invest in these other things. So in all, we actually had almost $400,000 in reduction in operating expenditures, which was much higher than what we anticipated. People really rolled up their sleeves. And then $95,000. We have this tendency, it's not across all areas, but we have multiple programs or areas that carry equipment replacement and repair lines individually. And so if I've got a piece of equipment and I'm worried it might, go south this year, I'm going to stick $90,000 or $50,000 or $20,000 in my budget. And what happens is year after year we're tying up those dollars, and a lot of times we don't end up using it. We pulled all that out, and it didn't equate to much this year. It was about $95,000, and said, let's centralize it. Let's pull it out and say, you know what, if something breaks, we'll fund it. There's a request process, we'll get it out, we'll fund it, and we'll do it, instead of having all those different reserves kind of out in the different areas. So after all is said and done, we figured we had about $2.5 million that we could reallocate. So continuing on page 15 there is the distribution of these funds and what we're proposing. And here's how it's going to work out. So compensation package. As we've done year after year, we have to honor commitments to educational advancement. We're anticipating about $45,000 for that. $60,000 for market adjustments. I'll talk a little bit about the salary increase at the bottom. We have non-benefited employees that we may need to look at in terms of a market adjustment to make sure that we are actually competitive with the market. We also have changes that happen over the course of the year that lead to reclassification of positions and things like that. We do that based off of market often. So we carved out $60,000 to say, as we have those market adjustments, we'll have some funds to actually do those. Vacancies, replacements, reclassifications, this 113, some of that includes market adjustments that we did this year. If you recall, as we were sort of working on the changes to our security personnel and staffing model, we identified that we were paying our security personnel well below market. In some cases, $3 and $4 per hour below. We made that adjustment and said we need to adjust to market to ensure we have a good quality pool. Those are the types of things. As we've reclassified positions, one in IR, those had some expense associated with it. That's what that $113,000 represents. The 130 is the employee incentive bonus. At this point, I'm recommending to you that we basically honor what the state suggested is, and we pay that out to qualifying employees in a one-time bonus. We're looking at some changes that we're not quite sure on the timing, and I don't know that we've even nailed down the specific identification of how much goes to who. But by the time, certainly by the time you would approve the budget in July, we'll have that figured out. But right now, they gave 130, we're going to take 130, and would be a one-time retention incentive. Retirement contribution, you'll see it's higher than that $25,000. That's because the state funds only the state share. We have to fund the local share, so $41,000 represents that 1/4% that the college would fund. Then the employees would have to pick up, and they'll fund the other 1/4% to get to the 0.5%. And then the big one, which is the 2.5%, or what equates to, I believe, approximately one step salary increase for nearly all of our benefited employees here at the college. And that's a big one, $527,000. And I recommend that to you strongly because I think the campus deserves it, both as a cost of living adjustment, but because of their work in handling this budget as we went forward. A few others here, instructional areas. Again, honoring your interest and our commitment to increasing instruction. That $292,000 represents 4 new full-time faculty positions. We are still going through the prioritization process and updating that, much like we did the budget, one-time budget process. So I don't know who or where those 4 faculty positions are going yet until that process plays out here in the next month. And then there's some continuation of specific biology positions for about a $438,000 continued investment or new investment in instruction. Student services, we take what we anticipate to be the reduction in athletics fees here. We have a reduction in revenue. We got to take the reduction in expenditures. And then $200,000 represents the investment in student services. And this is predominantly to go to staff and fund the new advising model at LCCC.
Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Could I ask a couple of questions and maybe point out something here? It's indeed gratifying that we've got 4 new instructor positions in here, but my understanding at this point is that these really aren't 4 new instructor positions, that probably some number of them will be moving people from grants to full-time status on the general fund. So that's one point of clarification, that it's not really new positions, or are they?
No, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, while I anticipate we may have 1 or 2 requests that are requests to move people from grant-funded positions here, I don't know that those will rise to the top. Our intent is essentially to fund 4 full-time positions. Again, as we move that through, evaluate each request based on the criteria, very similar to the rubric for the one-time investments. As we move forward, those positions that impact your priorities and the institution the most, predominantly our students, will rise to the top. And so I don't know who those are, but I anticipate very few requests that would be grant funds, and they have to make it through the gauntlet to go through. So if I were a betting man, and sometimes I might just be, I would be willing to bet that these will be 4 new full-time faculty positions.
Oh, very good. I'm glad to hear that. Now, one other question though. In setting aside money for more institutional support here for instruction, we've got some succession problems that we've talked about in the past, and I'm wondering what monies could be set aside to help with the succession. And the thing I'm talking about specifically is, let's take Rich Laidlaw as an example. He's the only guy on the campus that knows how to maintain and operate and teach people how to operate all of that expensive investment we've got in chemistry down there. It would be terrific, and it's going to raise some expense to the college to, as he decides to retire, to maybe keep him on part-time for a year while he trains a replacement to come in here. And we're going to be basically paying for an extra half-time position in chemistry. The same is true of diesel technology. I can't believe that there aren't other places on the campus where we aren't facing the same problem. And I don't see any of that in this budget, but in coming years, I think we've just about got to do it, yes?
Sure. Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, there will be, I'll reference some revenues we've set aside specifically to handle some of those things. But yes, one thing that I don't believe the campus has utilized much, if at all, in the past are post-retirement contracts. It's a mechanism that I would like to use more, and we've been looking into it this year, but that is the type of situation where a post-retirement contract could be leveraged to keep somebody in some level of capacity to help transition that. But it's a good point, and my understanding is that we had Chengdu hired, and we were supposed to be grooming that. So I'll look to Dr. Fierro to make sure that as we look at the succession of some of those senior faculty, we have upcoming faculty and they're receiving the incumbent training to actually develop along that line. But I'll point out some revenues that we've actually set aside, or some funds we've set aside to kind of accommodate for those things. Then just quickly, a few things underneath the president's area, and this isn't my office completely. It includes HR, IT, and other areas. You see we had to take the reduction of $120,000 in the high-tech fees. And then the continuation, we budgeted for the Associate Vice President of Effectiveness for 6 months, and this year we'll have to fund the other 6 months as we go forward. We have not filled that position, so there will be some carryover vacancy savings with it. And then strategic initiatives. So remember I said we had to carve out some of the one-time funds, the $800,000 one-time funds. So the first thing we did is we took $300,000 and set that aside for strategic initiatives. Those essentially equated to equipment requests, and those were the items that you heard Cindy and Chad talk about prioritizing. How are we going to spend those $300,000? We also carved out $200,000 originally to look more at not equipment requests, but strategic things. New program startup, program marketing, piloting specific promising practices, things like that. I'll admit that I didn't, and I'll take the blame for that, didn't put together a very good process to request or ask people for those requests. But it opened up a window of opportunity because there was $200,000 carved out. This became one of the largest chunks that we've essentially moved to the 1 mil. So by moving $200,000 of general fund expenditures to the 1 mil, we were able to move with this and with some of the valuation changes almost all of the base commitments off of the 1 mil, except for predominantly the instruction and the things associated with the Pine Bluffs Outreach Center. So there is $200,000 sitting liquid outside of $250 that we've said. I think I'm right in $250 for institutional planning. That's in the 1 mil, and then the $750 that's in there for facilities types projects. We've moved that over. So the vast majority of the 1 mil is one-time only commitments or flexible money. So there is $200,000 plus for just initiatives that come up, plus the $250 for planning that I doubt we will use in this year. So there's liquid funds to do just the type of thing that you're talking about. If these situations come up, if we need a post-retirement contract, if we need to start a new program, or we want to strategically market, we've tried to create liquidity in the 1 mil. To do that. So while we weren't able to actually get these requests out in a way, or I wasn't able to put a system together to get it out, it did provide an opportunity to move significant base commitments off of the 1 mil, and we took advantage of that. And then you see the $50,000 again that went into 1 mil as part of the planning. So strategic initiatives equates to about $500,000. And then our reserve accounts. Again, going into this knowing that we're going to be asked for budget cuts or budget proposals, we said, okay, let's look at it. If enrollment changes, where do we have the enrollment reserve? You know, if equipment breaks, where do we have that reserve? And where do we have some funds set aside that as we go into next year, if we have to take a reduction, we're not going to have to take a heavy hit. Let's plan ahead. So of that, about $512,000 is associated with reserves. In the end, it's, again, a balanced budget. And I think a fairly well balanced and designed. I will point out that right now, about $19,000 of this budget we have $19,000 of one-time funds that are currently dedicated to ongoing funds. So from a base fund for this year, the year is structurally balanced, but in terms of what we can expect next year, we will have to find at least $19,000 of savings. And in a $40-some million operating budget, $19,000 won't be hard. We think we can find that just by managing our enrollment. But the operating budget is sound. In fact, I'm very impressed with the work of the campus, to be quite honest with you. So I'm going to take a break. Carol's going to walk through real quickly the different funds and just highlight the purpose and the changes, and then.
Mr. President, Ed Mosher would like to ask a question.
President Schaefer, I was just wondering, in terms of the operating reserve, when I look and try to figure out what category or where that might be, when we look at the headings, whether it be instruction or public service or academic administration, whatever, I'm just trying to find an explanation or a description for operating reserve.
Yeah, it's an operating enrollment reserve. I believe we code that under the instruction code. It's intended to be set aside should enrollment drop or fluctuate, that we have revenues to pay the commitments that we have there. So as enrollment drops, we have fixed costs associated with our faculty. And regardless of whether or not we have students, we're actually having those loads. So that reserve, I believe the reserve is coded under the instructional program area.
Okay. And then operating expense savings. You had about $400,000, that's on page 14. Tell me a little bit about those savings that the different areas we're looking at, where did those savings come from?
All over. Predominantly, I believe the operating expenditures. Well, let me, actually, while Carol's going, I can pull up and tell you specifically. I just have to pull up another sheet to tell you what percent of reductions came from what specific area. We looked at these operating reductions at the vice president level. We didn't want to make this approach an across-the-board cut. We knew we had certain percentage thresholds that we had to shoot for, and operating expenditures, it was 4%. But we didn't want to say every unit, every area, and every unit has a 4% reduction. We wanted to look at that reduction at the vice president level, recognizing that some areas might actually have an increase in operating. Oh, was that in their book?
No.
Oh, good. Or good, not good that it's in there, but.
Oh, really? Oh, hiding things again, are we?
Was that a Freudian slip? It's good that she has that, because she'll be able to report that to you and take a look. And so. Here, let me see that. Let me pull it up, and then I can read through it too while Carol goes through this. But it was not across the board. Some areas took greater reductions, and like I said, we tried to make sure that instruction took the lowest reduction in operating expenditures. And I believe that held true, even though they did reduce operating expenditures.
Can you give me, and I'm not looking for detailed specifics here, but I was trying to understand what kind of categories we're looking at, not amounts so much as, you know, did we quit using coal or wood or, no, I say that facetiously, but, you know, what did we cut? Markers or supplies, or what are we looking at here?
A significant amount of supplies were reduced. Some of it was the removal of those equipment reserve, repair reserve pieces. Jane, help me out. What were the other things that were?
Big cut in postage.
Oh, big cut in postage, reductions in utilities to be more efficient. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. Some in travel, contracted services. I mean, I think it was across the board, and it really depended on the specific areas. We had some areas that had exponential growth in supplies. We tried to reduce back. We had some that had growth in other areas like site copies. I mean, I think it was really variable depending on the specific area.
And these were made at levels such that we would not expect this to, you know, we've got concerns about enrollment and what we're offering. This would not legitimately impact our ability to provide the services to students?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Mosier, you know, we'll commit to make sure that the service to the students is always high. But I would be lying if I said that I wasn't a little bit concerned at how deep we actually reduced in our operating. And really where the target was to reduce in our part-time staff and figure out how we could be more efficient with the full-time employees that we have. In the end, I've sort of come to some type of peace in my mind, because I think we still have considerable opportunity, especially with new faculty coming in, to be more efficient in the way that we actually offer our programs and schedule our programs and utilize our full-time faculty. I think we can make up some ground in the adjunct utilization. Like I said, once we actually know where those full-time positions are going, I think we'll already have some ground we can make up in the adjunct. We will free up resource, and as we do that, we will try to populate the enrollment reserve. And then if we run into issues for operating expenditures within an instructional area, we'll have some revenues to actually move back over. We'll also have those funds within the one mill to do some of that. So I think we've protected ourselves, but you know, I would say that I was surprised and a bit concerned with how deep we cut in operating as we went into this year. And we just need to be cognizant of that and make sure we have enough resources to step back in should something happen that requires that we invest in it. And of course, if enrollment increases, we will have the function and the benefit of increased tuition and fee revenues, which will help that as well.
Okay, I just had a couple of more here. I'm wondering, in terms of the 2.5% salary increase, which I definitely support and think we need, that we're really looking at that if we're talking, and I think appropriately so, as a cost of living adjustment, that would be on the base. And I noticed your wording there, and that's what concerned me a little bit. You said almost everyone, and I was thinking if we're talking cost of living, I was thinking we would be looking at it being on the base so that it flows through to everyone.
Correct. It is a base commitment that would go through. We have a couple of issues that we have to work through there. One of those is according to our pay and step and grade model. This would equate to a step, roughly a step, a 2.5% step. We have people that are at the very far end, and so we've heard about the terminology red line, red circling, those types of things. In the past, I believe when we've done this, what we've given those people who are at the very top, we've given them one-time payments versus actual base building payments. I don't know that we've come to a decision or that I've come to a decision exactly how we would handle that. And it seems like we've used different approaches in the past. I would certainly like and value input from the board as to how we might handle that. But the reality is we do have some people here that when you look at, assuming the steps recognize the market with, what the market would pay for that position, we have some people right now that are actually far beyond what the market would actually pay, even with experience and longevity and those types of things. And so the question is what do you do with those people? The past practice has been you give them the 2.5% as a one-time payment, but it's not base building. And I don't know if I could support that or not. The other point, when I say almost all employees, I believe this includes all benefited employees except for me. And it would not be my place to recommend a pay raise for me to you. That's a conversation you have to have as a board. So,
Okay. The last question I'll ask on that area would be back with some of the additional funds that we would potentially have available out of the 1 mil. I would hope we would look at the succession planning, some options there, not just in terms of faculty as the chair had indicated, but also with regards to administrative succession planning. And that's a concern that I think we've ran into problems with before and we really need to focus on.
yeah, Mr. Chairman, Trustee Kilty, Trustee Mosier, close. I must be programmed. We do carry over within the budget as we have in the past. We do have professional development funds. Many of the actual operating lines have travel and professional development funds or cost of doing business funds. There are some things we are trying to do, as you'll hear at your next meeting when we talk about the changes that we're doing in the performance management process and look at professional development. I think we will have needs and identify needs and goals to invest in certain people to help grow and provide that succession planning, and that may very well be one of the things that we have to dip into. My experience thus far has been that we have a lot of professional development funds distributed across this campus. We didn't really get the opportunity to take a look how strategically those are allocated. We did talk, I know Dr. Fierro brought it up here as we were sort of wrapping up this proposal to you, that may be another candidate where really what we need to do is separate cost of doing business type of travel and leave that in the operating budgets, but truly professional development funds, actually centralizing that and creating more strategic opportunities to invest in professional development that will help advance the board's priorities as well as advance people who we see as natural candidates for succession.
Thank you.
I have more paperwork to bring up with me, so I need to step around here a little bit. Thank you. I'm going to pick up with the 1 mil. Dr. Schaefer has talked a lot about the information that's here, but I wanted to make sure that you understood that the 1 mil is a separate fund, and one of the things that wasn't mentioned previously is that one of the reasons that we do separate it is not included in the 8% calculation. For the new board members, we are restricted in the amount of money that we can carry over from a biennium to 8% of your total revenue, basically 8% of your total revenue for the biennium. And this 8 mil, or this 1 mil is not included in that calculation, and so in order for us to be able to do that efficiently, we've separated it into a separate fund by itself. So that's another reason that we would do that. And as we talked about earlier, it is a permissive levy that you will take action on every 2 years, and the statute reads that it can be used for college operations, and so that's how we have been using it. And we are estimating that that the revenue to that fund will be up just a little bit, and that's because of the positive trend upward of the property assessments, not a lot, but up a little bit. And we are hearing, and I think the reason that Laramie County is up as opposed to either flat or down is that we're not as mineral dependent as some of the other counties are that support their community colleges. And then we did talk about freeing up some of that so that it was more liquid, and Dr. Schaefer talked about how that $200,000 came over and allowed us to do that. And so we'll have a lot more opportunity for the things that we want to do in that fund. And then I did want to make sure that you understood that we have accumulated a sizable fund balance, sizable in about $2 million. And we believe that we can begin to use some of that funding. So you'll see a revenue entry there for a carryover budget of $750,000. That really is the fund balance that we want to use in this fund. And as Dr. Schaefer indicated, that will be for initially for the expansion of the CT building to handle the new welding program. And then we have the $200,000 that we have for strategic initiatives, which Dr. Schaefer has talked about quite a bit. Okay, the next fund is the auxiliary fund, and that's on page 25. And I thought it would be helpful for at least the new board members to understand kind of what we're doing in each of these funds. And this particular fund is for, it's designed to be for on-campus services that to students and faculty and staff, and there's a fee charged for that, and it's intended to be on a cost recovery basis. And we're going to have just a slight increase in that budget request, and that is due mainly to the residence halls and the change in the meal plan. We did not increase the rates to students. We're trying to keep the costs for living in the residence hall reasonable to students, so we do not have a rate change, and the only increase that you see here for the most part is for the meal plan, and that is going up a little bit. The 5 Mil Fund is, again, another fund that right now the only thing that's remaining in that is the residual amount from a millage that we had in 1998 for remodeling. So it's really pretty old. And you do have an opportunity to go out to the voters for a 5 mil and to do a big project. And apparently at that in 1998 we had several big projects that we wanted to do. If you'll recall, last year we talked about dedicating this to planning, and that's what we've done. And we are using that for. We're currently in the process of doing both level 2 plans on the University Student Center and the Flex Tech building. It won't, the amount of money that's in there won't cover both of those, but it'll go a long ways for that. So we have dedicated that, the residual of that, and hopefully we can get that spent, and this will come off our books here pretty quickly. Okay, on
May I
page.
ask-
Yes.
Carol.
Excuse me,
Trustee Erickson.
May I ask a question on, just to understand the 5 mil fund? This 5 mil fund is available by the trustees, motion of some sort, or does it have to go to a vote of the people? How do you get the 5 mil money?
Trustee Kelty, Trustee Erickson, it does have to go to the vote of the people,
Okay.
and it's only for 4 years. We can only do it for 4 years.
Thank you.
Okay, the restricted fund is on page 31. And this fund is exactly what it's called, a restricted fund. So any of the funds, any of the revenue that we have in here is restricted to whatever the purpose is that the external donor has, it's not really a donor, the external agency has put on it. So this is where we have our federal grants, our state grants, and this year it's pretty flat again. There is on page 28 is a listing of the ones that we have. And the biggest part of this fund is in our scholarships, our federal scholarships. the Pell, the EEO, or direct loans, SEOG funds. So that's the largest part of that. And in this budget, we have one new fund, one new grant in the federal fund, and one new grant in the state fund as well. And then we have an estimate in there for grants that might come in through the year. So there's one in there that's just kind of unrestricted until we find out what new grants that we might have.
Carol, Trustee Erickson would like to ask another question.
Yes.
Just to understand the federal grants and contracts, the $9,759,000, this is what is expected for the next fiscal year.
Correct.
What are we receiving in the current fiscal year, just for one of them, just say like for Pell? You're expecting $5 million, what are we getting for this fiscal year?
Actually, it's very close to that.
Up or down?
Excuse me.
Up or down? We're gonna get more this time or less
Yes,
this time?
we're projecting more, but just about 200,000 more.
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Erickson, you know, one of the things, there are two dynamics with that. One of the dynamics is the number of students who are Pell eligible, and we assume we'll have a fairly representative continuation of that. But at least for next year, Pell will increase slightly. It was at 5,500. I think it goes to 56. Judy, do you remember? It's not a large increase, but it is a slight increase. So if we have the similar number of Pell eligible students that come through with that slight increase, assuming that they get that increase, it should equate to a slight increase for us. And I think that's how that budget came together. But did you find what it was?
Right. The current year, it's $9,572,584. And what we're projecting is $9,759,957. So it's a slight increase there.
And my reason for asking the question has to do with sequestration. And I guess it seems a little bit risky to be predicting an increase when we see that there's going to be reductions.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Trustee Erickson, two things there. One, you know, we do not know exactly how this will impact. In Pell was actually kept outside of the sequestration, will not be impacted, but there's already conversation about when and if we actually do set a budget at the federal level, whether or not Pell will escape that, what the impacts will be. I believe, and since we have Cher here, I believe we've already had some communication of there could be some impacts in the next year with the operating budget for like TRIO. Could be anywhere between $10,000 and $20,000. Is that, am I getting close, Cher? The difference with the restricted fund is that if we have decreased revenues, we just simply have to decrease the expenditures, and so we adapt to those changes as the year unfolds. So, knowing Cher, I'm sure if we know that we're going to have a $12,000, $15,000 reduction as part of sequestration, we'll adjust our operating expenditures accordingly. Or she'll be knocking on my door for more money. Is that maybe it? So that's the intent, though, of the restricted fund, is that we actually have to accommodate. It's restricted not only to the purpose, but to the revenues that we have to
I
operate
understand
within.
the restricted fund. I'm concerned about the prediction. It appears that the prediction is somewhat optimistic. And it's, I'm concerned as it pertains to the federal goings-on.
Of those, Trustee Erickson, of the grants and contracts listed here, if you look at federal, so look above, the federal grants and contracts underneath, Gear Up and Perkins, I'm not sure about, but the TAACT, the TACT grant, the ENBRI grant, those are committed grants for the fiscal year. So those aren't funds that we anticipate we'll be having the hits from. Some of the other larger ones, such as Perkins and some of the other ones, you know, we don't know how that will impact us. But we're not sure whether we'll have an impact or not, and so we're budgeting as we anticipate being able to operate, and we'll roll with the punches.
So as you roll with the punch, we may get one big one to the board. No such risk?
Dr. Kilty, Trustee Erickson, I'm not quite understanding what
I'm meaning?
Yeah, looking just at the percentages of the reductions that may hit some of these grants, and looking at how they're applying or talking about applying sequestration, I'm struggling to find or see that there are going to be massive reductions to any of these things. In fact, the approach thus far seems to be fairly moderate to what they're doing. They're spending actually more time on big political items than anything else. Yeah, I mean, perhaps we could take the sort of sky is falling approach, but all our indications are that it's not there, and we hope. We don't know this. We hope that we'll have enough lead time to plan accordingly. And again, if I were a betting man, my bet would be more of these impacts we will see in FY15 than in FY14, just because of the time that it takes to make the cuts and have that roll downhill.
Just last comment, I guess what you're saying is that you think you're capable, and the staff and the administration is capable to tweak as we move along through this year, given the overall budget.
Yes, Trustee Erickson, Dr. Kilty, if one thing we are, it is adaptable. And so we will tweak and adjust accordingly.
But we won't get a big surprise.
I will not give you a big surprise.
Oh, yeah. Trustee Mosier.
Following on with the listing of the grants, not necessarily just with the federal, but
What page
including.
are you on, please?
Page 28.
Thank you.
When you're looking at these grants, and it follows along a little bit with Trustee Erickson's perception there about what happens if those numbers are smaller, my wondering has to do with what are the implications for us in terms of backfilling. What's our approach? Do we have anything in place? I know we're adaptable, but how do we handle this? If it's certain kinds of things, we can probably make an adjustment. But if you're talking about personnel, I'm just wondering how we would plan to work with that, because we ought to have something in place.
Dr. Kilty, Trustee Mosier, it really depends on the specific grant that you are looking at. With Pell and direct loans, those are direct, grants made to students. College work study, again, made to students. We'd have to take a look at that. Some of the other ones we would have to adjust. I know the TACT grant and the INBRE grants, those are set budgets, and if something were to happen there, we'd have to make adjustments. But those are typically additional compensation or part-time employments. So as you look at those things, worst case scenario, what we may have to do is manage some of the staff. And again, we would probably look at part-time staffing within any one of the grant areas. We would have to look at reducing non-employee, so in terms of Perkins, if something were to happen there, which I don't think it is, until they renew or look at the legislation, we would be able to adjust within there. So I think we would apply very similar approaches to what we have done or are doing with the operating budget, looking at those that are most flexible and will have the least impact directly onto the students, and taking those reductions first. It's not impossible or improbable that there may be a case where we may have to look at a service that we feel so strongly about that even if federal funds go away, we want to help backfill that or to do that. And again, having the liquidity within the 1 mil and some of the other reserves gives us at least that flexibility to have those conversations if that type of thing were to come up.
Thank you.
Okay. Trustee Kilty, Trustee Erickson, one thing that I might add is this is the first look, the first presentation of the budget. You'll see this in May and June, and then again in July to be able to approve it. And as we learn more, then we'll adjust these numbers if necessary. So before this budget even is approved, we have 3 months more to go on it. And so we'll adjust as we know more. And then if it gets into next year and we find that we have to bring back what we would call a negative budget amendment to you, we would also do that as information becomes available. So that's how you would control what we would do, is through our budget presentations and then also our amendments if we need to do that. Okay. Moving on to the endowment fund. It's on page 33. This fund we use basically for the state challenge match, and we have met our match. And so you'll see that the budget request is decreased. And then also the projections for investment income was pretty low. Now we still have an opportunity to bring in money and have it partially matched if we can find one of the other institutions that haven't gotten their allotment matched, and they agree to let us use some of that, then we would split the amount of money we would get from the state. So we would get half and they would get half. And so there's still some opportunity there, but not to the extent that it has been. And we are not believing that the state's going to, they didn't re-up it in this next legislative session. Whether it might come back later on or not, I don't know. But anyhow, that's the reason for the reduction. And the investments, we don't actually invest ourselves. That's done at the state level, and then they give us the interest, so we really don't control that. But as investments have not been very good, neither has this one, so we've taken that budget down some for that. Any questions on the endowment fund? Okay, the plant fund is used for the acquisition of long-term assets and for the renewal and replacement of campus properties, for debt service payments, and to account for long-lived assets. So we do a lot in this plant fund. There'll be a slight increase in the facility fee revenue, and that's the fee that we use to pay the debt service on the 2009 bonds. And so we're projecting a small increase there. There's no new state revenue. The two pieces of state revenue that we receive there are major maintenance and the contingency reserve, and they're both biannually appropriated to us. For major maintenance, they gave us the whole appropriation last year, and so you see zero for this year, but it's because the appropriation from last year was intended to cover both years. The contingency reserve is also biannually based, but they only gave us half last year, and they'll give us hopefully half this year. Remember, that's going to be contingent upon whatever happens with the mineral lease money, and we know that's in question right now. But right now, we're still planning on that coming. And so the projects that you see there will be projects that are carried over, and we're showing that we're showing all zeros in the actual projects, but that's because that'll come through on the when we bring in the carryover budget. And that's one thing I should mention. All the way through these funds, we could have a potential for carryover funding, and we won't have that number till a little closer to the end of the fiscal year, and we know what we're going to carry over. So you'll for sure see that number change in all the funds that have carryover budget. And obviously, one of the big ones is the plant fund. The other big one is the operating fund. Okay, on page 38 is the total budget summary. You can see that our total budget is decreased across all funds by about 5%, or $3,658,000. But we believe that we still have maintained strong fiscal health. We preserve the core operations. We've invested in stronger instruction, service to students and our people, and we've developed through, this whole budget was developed through a collaborative and collective effort. And with that, I'll entertain any questions.
Questions from the board? Trustee Mosier.
It was back earlier on, and Dr. Schaefer was covering that, and I can't remember which item, but on the calculation of the redistribution of funds, it is a redistribution because all counties participate in that, or is it just the 7 counties that have community colleges?
It's only the 7 counties that pay in the 4 mil.
And those counties, I'm sorry, I jumped over you there, but are those, which counties are likely to see increases that facilitate seeing an overall increase in that?
I think we're one of the only ones that believe that we're actually going to have a little bit of an increase. Westerns County, I think it's Sweetwater, is projected to be down. Sheridan's County is projected to be down. Natrona's projected flat. So we're not looking for additional funding there. We believe that it'll actually be cut. And part of the reason we go through this recapture redistribution process is that when they run the formula, they are running it based on an estimate. And at the end of the year, once we know what the assessments were, then they true that up, and they do it through this, what they call the recapture redistribution.
Thank you.
Any other board members? Anyone from the staff or faculty? Questions? Anyone from the general public? Yes.
I was wondering,
Would you identify yourself,
I'm
please?
sorry, I'm Casey Orr, I'm here with Wingspan, but as a concerned student, I had a question about the increase in the plant things. Is that just regular light bulbs and stuff like that? Or is that, oh, I'm sorry, let me go back to the page. I was looking in the general overview on page 12. Let's talk about, on the general overview on page 12, the operations and maintenance account, it's about $600,000. I was wondering if that's just, if there was something specific that was kind of going towards, if there was something big that changed or a project that students can look forward to happening, that money is supposed to be allocated for, or what the purpose for like a jump in the plant maintenance was.
Mr. Chairman, I think I can address that. He's looking at the trend data, correct, on page 12 there in the jump there. That, if you recall, we were talking about moving, we call it carryover, but essentially we're taking $750,000 out of the fund balance. So, Casey, each year, if there's more revenue generated than expenses, we essentially put those things as a savings account. It becomes a balance within that fund. As we look forward at some of the interim facilities projects, one is the expansion of the CTE building that will temporarily house welding and possibly process technology. We know we also have some renovations that we want to do within the student services area. You've probably heard talk there, that's part of that project that would then include the other revenue, which is for the student lounge, and then some of those things. Those funds would come over to allow us some revenues to be applied for those types of facilities improvements in the year. And so it is actually taking money out of savings, carrying them over into this year and using them for some of those facility projects. What I can say is I think as each of those projects mature, the students will actually see great benefit from the expenditures of those funds, because it will impact the facilities that they're living, eating, and learning in.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions from the public? Butch?
Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Schaefer had mentioned, what is it, the performance funding component from the state commission, and you said that LCCC did not fare too well with that particular development. Do you have some ideas or suggestions how we might be able to get some more of those funds?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cato, good to see you. Thanks for coming over. Is that obvious I was buying time? No, all joking aside, I think we do. One thing I do want to point out is currently our pass rate, so this is successful course completion, the percent of our students who successfully complete their courses is, I think where it went down this year was about 73%. And so that does remain the lowest in Wyoming, but we compare that nationally as part of the Community College Benchmarking Project, and it's right in the mix. In fact, it might actually be higher than the median successful course completion rate for community colleges across the U.S. So in general, Wyoming does quite well with those completions, but in some cases we're a full 10 percentage point below some of our other campuses. We are looking at a variety of things that may impact that. We're working on actually moving and trying to get away from late registration. We think allowing people to register late and get into courses late may actually impact their ability to succeed. We're looking at how we actually track students past census state to make sure that when we have students, we have students that will register for more courses than they plan to take, and making sure they're dropping at a certain time. There's some administrative mechanisms we're trying to truly identify those types of things. But then from an instructional standpoint, we're really working on myriad activities to get in there, working with the faculty to help improve assessment, talking about this new advising system that as part of it will incorporate alert systems and opportunities to actually connect with students. There's a variety of things that we'll be implementing to hopefully reverse that trend and get where at least the other community colleges in Wyoming are. In general, it's $8 million. Here's one of the things that was sort of interesting. It's a fair use of completion or performance for completion funding or performance funding. The reality is, of that $8 million, when we actually apply the successful course completion, only about $180,000 of it actually changes hands. Versus if you were just to take that $8 million and distribute it based on how it's distributed in the model, really only about $180,000 of it actually shifts hands based off of the metric when we use this way, and quite a bit of that has gone from out of LCCC to another campus. So this year, I think it was another $50,000 we anticipated as part of the reduction with that. So it's on our radar, and we're certainly looking at it.
Mr. Chairman, maybe one more question.
Sure.
You mentioned set aside $200,000 for the strategic initiatives, and then we're learning a little bit about declining enrollment. Are there certain programs in which we have some capacity to grow, in which maybe we could then target, be a little aggressive on recruiting students for those certain programs? And I'm thinking with the demographics going on in Wyoming, with maybe high school students declining, in population, that maybe our adjacent states like Colorado or Nebraska might be, and I know there's some tuition differences, but just looking at how do we maybe take advantage of, if that strategic initiative exists, of looking at those areas to maybe grow the college a little bit.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cato, good question, very good question. In fact, there are a couple of things that we want to look at. One of those is capturing new enrollment, and I think you've hit on some very valid targets. The proximity to states, especially Colorado, who are struggling, increased tuitions, capacity issues, things like that, present an opportunity for us, and we're already seeing a large influx of those students as they come in, many of which come for our healthcare programs. It does provide an opportunity for us to grow new students and look at new markets. The other piece that is really evident, we are still serving a very traditional student at LCCC, median age of 21 or 22. These are folks that have come out of high school, and there is a significant population. I think there's an estimated almost 90, 100,000 young adults in Wyoming with some college but have not completed a degree. We know that there's a healthy young adult market for higher education here. Unfortunately, many of those are going to the for-profit providers that exist within the community. That adult market, especially the young adult market, is a market we really need to be engaging at a much, much higher level. What we found is our programming really isn't designed to accommodate that. Trustee Kilty made a comment about some of that, the shift away from entire programs being available at night. Those students that end up having to fall back then are the ones that are working, and they're typically our young adults. So I think that's one of the big things that we're looking at. We're looking at that through, again, revisiting evening courses, weekend courses, accelerated courses, really trying to put some rigor and coherence to programs delivered online that would allow us to capture new students. But the other piece, and the one that I think is actually more appealing to me, is just retaining our students. We lose approximately half of our students every year. They're here for a year and then they go away the next year. A lot of them do transfer over to the university, but we're losing students every year. And if we can just employ retention strategies that would get them back in the next fall, that actually bolsters that enrollment. So instead of having to keep on refilling with new students, getting them to come back. And there's some interesting things that are happening out there. Take scholarships, for example. There's some campuses that have had some success with shifting away from front-loaded scholarships to incentive-based scholarships. And they do that through tuition waiver. So imagine, if you will, you come to LCCC and you're paying full way your first year. But if you come back for your second year, you get a half tuition waiver for the entire time of your second year as an incentive to continue. If that brings a student back that we may have lost, it's actually a net gain to the institution. And because our tuition is so low, most of it is funded by the state, the FTE actually brings a greater revenue than what the tuition does. So there's some unique things that we're exploring and trying to look at and how we can actually incentivize greater retention rates. And I think that may have more of an overall impact on our enrollment than even getting new people into the campus.
Trustee Erickson.
Carol, you indicated that we will have a second and third review of the budget as it is further refined down the road before it'll actually be approved. Will there be, let me say that I noticed that the revenue and the expenses for the Albany campus and for the Warren field office and for the Pine Bluffs field office are subsumed within all the categories.
Right.
Will we receive information as to the revenue and expenses for those three operations down the road?
Trustee Kelty, Trustee Erickson, not specifically in the budget document, but we can certainly provide that for you.
I would like to see that, yes.
Okay? So you want Warren, excuse me, let me clarify, you want the Warren Air Force
Our
Base?
three
you want-
outreaches.
Okay, so Pine Bluffs.
The Albany campus, the Warren field office, am I saying that correctly?
Mhm.
The field office, and the Pine Bluffs
Bluffs,
field
okay.
office.
I don't know where we stand on questions here, but I would like to go back and mention one thing that, to sort of a follow-up to some of Butch's comments. And I don't often like to put people on the spot, but we have Cher Warren here tonight, and I'd just like to give her some kudos. She runs Sage Trio. Sage Trio takes students who by most measures should be among our worst succeeders and so forth. And Sage Trio does a darn good job of retaining students, getting them to complete. And I just wonder what aspects of that program could be scaled up, and have you looked at what aspects of that program that could be scaled up to help success in the general population on the campus, not just Sage Trio?
Mr. Chairman, it's a good question, and one of the things that actually is underpinning a lot of the conversation at the policy level, both nationally and state level. We have very successful programs such as Trio, Gear Up, and those things, but they touch such a small population, and the conversation right now is about scale. How do you scale? How do you scale? How do you scale? Those types of things. The way we've implemented Sage Trio here is really through a very intrusive and personalized advising model. And Cher, kick me if I'm getting off track here. That concept of personalized, individualized, and in some ways, intrusive advising is one of the things we hope to scale as an aspect of our institution-wide advising model. You have to be there for people, and sometimes some of those students don't know when they need help. They're first generation, they're low income, they don't come from a family that speaks that language. That type of a student actually is in every corner of our campus. Those are the types of things that we're trying to look at as we scale. Sometimes those scales require an investment, and why there's $200,000 in this budget to start moving us in that direction. They require an investment to do, but I think there's numerous things that were happening through some of those special programs that we can learn from. And part of the reorganization and the intent of that was to do just that, is to get synergistic things together and say, how do we grow this? You know, what we don't need is a bunch of different boutique programs that exist. We need to find the best practices and high impact practices and scale those.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on the budget on this first reading? I guess I might just say that, frankly, in the face of some declining numbers, and I think you guys have done a really good job. I think this is the most clear presentation of the budget at first reading, and as you know, a lot of the proof of that will be in the details, which are yet to come. And I have some litmus tests that I always like to apply to details, so that could end up being a fly in the ointment here. But I thank you for a job that looks pretty well done at this point.
Thank you. The campus has done incredible work with this.
Next item on the agenda, policies, and I don't know how you plan to handle this, but I'm turning it over to you.
Mr. Chairman, these policies are four policies that will be coming forward in your April meeting. This is essentially information for you to know that these are the things we're going to ask you to act on at your April business meeting. I'm certainly happy to answer questions. Actually, I'm happy to punt your questions to the people in the room who can answer them accordingly, but we certainly don't need to. It's just really more of an informational item for you to have the materials, have the proposed policies, and know I will be asking you to take action and making recommendations on that action to you at April 17th at your business meeting. One thing I do want to point out, though, as a matter of protocol, and I've talked to the chair about this, and just to make it clear here, we've looped in your attorneys, our attorneys in, I believe we've looped in, you're getting, as we go out through consultative feedback, these policies are coming to you for consideration. I would highly recommend that at each business meeting where you entertain policy changes, that you ask for a recommendation or any input from your attorneys. They're here, they're spending the time to actually review the policies and procedures. Hopefully, and I believe they will, and have given us input as they're being developed, but I think it would be good practice for you as a board to consult your legal counsel on policies at each of those times. So I'll prod the chairwoman as well to do that, but make sure that we get the feedback from legal counsel as necessary.
Okay, thank
Mr.
you.
Chairman?
Yes, trustee
I got
Erickson.
an imaginary ball that I'm throwing over to you that you can then punt. In the honors policy, I am assuming that at the next time it comes to us, the criteria for the academic honors will be listed. Because here it says the purpose of this policy is to determine the criteria for academic honors. So when this policy comes to us, it will have the criteria?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Erickson, are those spelled, I'm looking at Dr. Fierro or Vice President Hay, are those spelled out in the procedure element of that?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Trustee Erickson, Mr. President. There is a link, and the first link is just a summary, the one you're seeing, and the second one is a link to go to all the policies. The full description of all the policies presented there is under academics, and you'll be able to see the full description. If you like full copies, I can get those to you.
Well, I can figure it out. I'll find it somehow, but it's there. The
Yeah,
criteria,
exactly.
it's already been determined.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
So for instance, in order for someone to graduate with honors basically on the president's list, it will require that that particular individual has 12 credit hours and a GPA of 3.75. Between 3.5 and 3.75 will be someone who will be in the vice president's list and then the dean's list.
I can see it. Fine, that answers my question, or my concern. Very good.
Trustee Mosier.
With regards to limited enrollment programs admissions procedures, on that one, when I look through there, that's one in particular I would think legal counsel could provide us some direction that we're not doing anything in there that in some way does what the policy says we're not to, in some fashion, discriminate. But I'd also like to ask the question is we have these limited enrollment programs, how do we make the decision that those are going to be limited enrollment? How do we ever review that and decide if we should change that? I know we have these programs. They've been around for a long time. Nursing is an obvious one. Dental hygiene, I believe, is another one. Equine used to be. I'm not sure if it still is. Still is one of those. And I guess I'm just kind of wondering why we don't know or how we make those decisions as to whether that's enrollment, if you could give us some insight on that.
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Mosier, I would say that there are really three things that I think drive that. One is accreditation requirements when there are certain ratios that are mandated, or accreditation requirements actually suggest that cohort size must be X. We have to actually accommodate within those ratios, and so it's a resource element, but when if we needed to add another faculty to add additional students, it's always a finite number where we don't have the opportunity for open entry, open exit types of things. That's one. Oftentimes facilities is another one that I believe leads to that determination. It gets a little bit more loose. I think most of our limited entry programs would fall under the accreditation piece, but then when we get to facilities and then when we get to safety are really the other issues. And when we have those confines by any of those three, that's where we determine them. The specific process, I don't know that I can answer how we vet that. I believe it actually comes along with the curriculum development and approval process as it moves through the ranks and then through the faculty, the academic standards, through the deans or LLT. I mean, I think those determinations are made at those times, but I don't know that we have set criteria specific to the process of how we make that determination.
The first recommendation, I believe, it comes from accrediting bodies and then it's endorsed by the faculty of that particular discipline. And then we are just
allowed to enforce those particular determinations, because as you said, some of those come straight from the accrediting bodies, and basically we just have to sort of seek the approval from the faculty of that particular discipline.
And, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah. Trustee
Part of the reason I asked that question, too, is we talk about best practices. And with these limited enrollment programs, we know, we have the statistics to show that the completion rates are fantastic, if I can use that. And I'm kind of wondering, you know, gee, if you want to make a program fantastic, then limit the enrollment.
What do our attorneys have to say about that?
Yeah, Dr. Hill to Trustee Mosier. There's a fine line there. I believe that what the best practices suggest is that cohort-based programs are very successful, and in some cases, fantastically successful. And part of that is actually the relationships that are established by cohort-based programs. But the other piece with that is those cohort-based programs are very prescribed and clear pathways through the programs. And so I would agree with you wholeheartedly. We need to be doing more to look at building relationships, creating the pathway, and I think we've got opportunity through learning communities or actual cohort assignments to programs. Even if it's specific delivery of a program, I think there's some great opportunity for us to look at that. I don't think I will touch the limited enrollment conversation at this point.
The other kind of hidden part of that is, and I could be wrong here, but for example, with nursing, I'm certain there are prerequisites that must be met. And prerequisites mean you're screening the potential candidates. If we're doing that for that program, in my mind, I just don't understand why we can't do something of that nature for other programs so that we can enhance. I mean, we're trying to spend our dollars wisely. We're trying to do what's best for the students, and I think we need to take and give some consideration to looking at those, maybe not doing the same thing, not the enrollment limitation per se, but there are sure some attributes there that we ought to be using for these other programs.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Trustee Mosier, I agree.
Did you, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, Trustee Mosier, you listed a couple of limited, one nursing, dental hygiene, what was the third one?
Equine.
Equine. Well, I noticed with nursing, definitely, the limited numbers are going down compared to what they were before, at least for the chart that you gave us today. And have I heard something that the semester now is, they bring in 40 new nurses per, or students per semester, or 80 for a year? Well, that also contributes to the fact that we got less enrollment for full-time equivalents.
Yeah, it could very well be, and we anticipate we'll actually reduce that intake by, I want to say 8 students this year. Is that correct, Stan? 8 students, predominantly as a result of limited access to clinical opportunities, which should actually be more than that because we've got such a robust opportunity to provide simulation, and we're really finding ways to augment clinical access to offsite sites and through simulation. But yeah, it's having an impact there too.
Other questions from trustee? Questions from staff or faculty? Any from the general public? The one general public person left. He'd had enough.
Chairman Kilty,
Uh,
respond to trustee
yes.
Mosher, if I may. Reviewing this policy, there doesn't appear to be any legal issues that I think we should be concerned with. The only thing I noticed as the lawyer is paragraph 3.0 doesn't appear to be a complete sentence, and I'm not sure exactly what it means. So perhaps we can review that for further clarification.
Okay. Good catch.
Thank you.
The next item on the agenda is just information only, unless there's something I'm missing here regarding next meetings. And there There being no other new business, I'm looking for a motion to,
Chairman
for,
Murphy?
yes.
I'd like to direct the board's attention to the alcohol-free campus policy. Take a look at that for a moment. I'm going to direct your attention to paragraph BC.
Mr. Chairman. I'm so used, see, I'm trained.
I didn't respond to Madam, so.
I was wondering if we're looking at procedure or policy.
The policy and purpose in the alcohol-free campus policy.
The event shall be,
Correct.
okay.
The event shall be monitored to prevent consumption by persons not of legal age. My concern with this particular provision is it creates a legal duty that you may not want to partake of and requires specialized training and people who, I don't know that the campus needs to be exposed to that type of liability per provision C. I would like to see the board strike that provision.
Or reword it.
Strike it.
What was, Mr. Chairman,
Trustee Mosier.
could someone perhaps tell us what the intent when this was put into that was?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Mosier, the intent of it was, and really falls into the procedural elements, when and if we were to allow any type of event on campus where alcoholic beverages would be served, the party that was responsible for providing the alcohol, which would not be the college necessarily, it would be somebody with a liquor license and all that, would be the one that would actually be responsible. These were expectations of the people that would be authorized on campus to actually do that. That's the intent of it. But perhaps that could be actually the expectation outlined within procedure versus actually within policy, and then that way it at least eliminates the obligation that you would have as a board, and rather becomes a procedural expectation for the type of vendor that comes to campus. Tara, is that closer?
Mr.
I believe that's the most prudent course at this point.
Mr. Chairman, and I may have fallen off a turnip truck getting here, but I thought we had I thought there was state law that prohibited alcohol from being on this campus.
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Mosier, we thought lots of things as we went into looking at this process, to be quite honest with you.
Same truck.
And some crazy turnip drivers around here. Yeah, in fact, we sort of scoured with the concept of dry campus and where that originated from, and looked at events that happen on UW and other campuses that have included alcoholic beverages, and really almost seems to be that we've developed a lot of these from just urban myth and certain edicts from various individuals. I will confirm again before we bring this to you at your April business meeting. But no, I believe you have the opportunity to determine how the facilities should be used and for what parameters you put on the use of those facilities. And so we do believe and really do want to adhere to the concept of a dry campus, but there are opportunities and considerations for certain types of events that will help us fulfill our public service mission, our community engagement mission, and really get the people that we want to have on campus. And so the exception process would allow to do that, but we will confirm and maybe look at the legal counsel as well to confirm, but I do not believe that there is state statute that restricts the use of or the alcohol being on campus.
I'm not aware of one, no.
Lisa, does that sound right too from your research?
It does, Mr. Chairman. We actually modeled this policy and procedure from Northwest Community College, and we looked at the other procedures and policies from the other community colleges. So that's really where we got some of our information. So I know that the other community colleges do have some exceptions.
Yeah.
So that's really, we did look to our other colleagues.
Mythbusters.
I think Tara's comments are well taken here. This is sort of some of the stuff that made me nervous about the gun policy too, that would maybe make us responsible for making sure that people didn't have guns on campus, and how are we going to handle that at that point? And this if the idea is to just make sure that the vendor of alcoholic beverages complies with state law, that could be stated in another way, yes?
Well, yes, I mean, I think it's the expectation that anybody on this campus needs to follow state law. And this campus does not condone any violation of state law. Period.
Do we need to actually to state that explicitly, or is that implicit in this?
I believe that's implicit.
So we shouldn't say a thing, maybe?
That's
Indeed.
what she's recommending.
Okay.
Mr. Chair?
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, we'll make that adjustment.
Is it a good time for a motion to adjourn?
It's a good time for a motion for an executive session.
Okay, then I'll make a motion to adjourn the study session and enter into an executive session to examine
A personnel
a
issue.
personnel issue.
Do I have a second?
Second.
This meeting is adjourned.
How long do we have?